Welcome to the lab. Thank you guys so much for coming tonight. We're really excited to see everyone here. We're super excited about this exhibition. And I'd love to introduce our panelists today. We have Dean Beard, who's the executive director of the lab. Drew Bennett, who's the founder and current director of the Facebook Artist in Residence program. Natasha Boaz, who's a curator and scholar and who wrote a really fascinating introductory essay to the open form book, which we'll talk about more. And Larry Rinder, who is the director of the Berkeley Art Museum Pacific Film Archive. And moderating the discussion is Fred Turner, who's the director of Department of Communication at Stanford University. So thank you all again, and we'll have some time for questions afterwards, so feel free to jump in on the conversation. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Okay, great. Hi, so I'm Fred, and it's my job to sort of open the conversation and get things going. I think we'll probably talk directly with the panelists for, I don't know, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and then try to open it up to questions and take it from there. So, you know, we've been talking before we all sat down in front of you, and we've been talking about how we live in a moment of ubiquitous digital media, ubiquitous screens, almost visual saturation. And so one of the questions that's on our plate is, what can art be? What can art, in a material sense, made by living people, by their hands, be in that kind of a setting? And more particularly, how can we as people who try to empower artists and art do that work? What kind of institutions can we build? What kind of politics can we support? You know, we have on this panel folks who've done a tremendous amount of work, not just to keep the arts alive, but to make them vibrant, to build community around them, to put them at the center of people's lives. And so I'd like to just open it up by asking each person to say a little bit about what they've done and how they've done it, what's worked in terms of sustaining art practice in your practice, and maybe a little bit about the political challenges that we're facing and some steps we might take to confront them.
All right, I guess I'm immediately to the right side. So the project that you're in right now is the lab, and the lab I think of as an ongoing experiment in precarity. Everything that we've done here has been precarious, has been a risk, has kind of challenged the kind of norms of the way that we take in knowledge and systems of power, and how we can we change our perceptual understanding. We shift our bodies literally a little bit to the right to see something differently. And that often means looking at process over product. It means looking at somebody's way of working rather than what they produce. And I think a lot about handedness, like how the artist's hand is actually a part of the work that's being made, and how their labor is implicated in that handedness. And so what we're doing right now is we're commissioning 3 artists per year, and we're trying to give them a living wage, which is between $25,000 and $85,000 a year. We're trying to give them health benefits. I keep saying trying, because trying is the operative word. And in our current funding system right now, that's really, really difficult to do, because giving an artist funding without caveats is very hard. And the artists I'm particularly interested in working with are artists who press my ways of working, who challenge the way that I kind of see the world and I function within this space, within these 4 walls, and how I kind of see myself in that situation. So they challenge my power systems of control and systems of power, and how I process the world around me. So every time we have an artist here, they're usually working maybe 3 to 4 or 5 months. They can ask me not to be here at all. They can ask me to be here all the time. They're really like, sometimes I'm a janitor only. But the idea is that when we commission an artist to do something at the lab, they can literally take the institution and change it completely to fit the parameters of their work and their project. So that's kind of my understanding of it.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Drew, keep it going.
All that stuff. Yeah, same for me. I came to San Francisco in 2005 after college, and pursuing a studio practice and interested in what being an artist was in society, but also how art functions in society. Like not its own artists' work and place within the art market, but how art exists everywhere in the larger context. And that kind of focus, wanting art to be in a place where it can intersect not just with people who are choosing to seek out galleries and identify as art interested folks, but so that the general public, like unart interested people, could be confronted with art ideas and art objects, was always top of mind for me. So working with Facebook to make art was a great opportunity to confront a non-art audience, or largely non-art viewing audience, with art up in their space, and then had an opportunity to build a program where artists were invited in to work alongside the Facebook employees. Wait, is this working? Yeah. To have the freedom and trust to choose a place to make a work of their own choice. I think it's an exciting opportunity for an artist. So, like, as an artist, like finding opportunities outside your regular studio practice to work. It could be painful, it could be uncomfortable, but that's valuable long term, because like the hope is when people ask like, what's a successful residency or commission or project, and really, I look at it as how, like, what can the artist take away from their experience? How are they like challenged, and how can they have gained new material or like technical or social advances in the way they think about their work, and that's kind of why we're here now. And this is an example of a lot of the artists that we've worked with at headquarters, and we've been able to expand the program globally. So it's really exciting, I think, for me and the rest of the team to be able to see an authentic group of earlier career artists from around the world now. And we're kind of wondering at this point, how can we make that network more visible, accessible, public? How can we continue to champion for these artists and champion for spaces and companies and other institutions to not only purchase artwork as decoration or to, like, I guess it's just as decoration, but to engage in artists in their practice, as Dina was saying, holistically, and embrace kind of unknown results. I think is something that's really important to me.
I love your notion of championing the artist, and I think that's something that, Natasha, you've actually done quite a bit in your career. Can you say a little bit about your role, particularly because you are a critic and a writer, and what do you do in this ecosystem?
Well, one of the things that as a curator, as a writer, as an educator, we have some of our students here from Berkeley, I like to ask questions. So it's a pedagogical exercise. So I'd like to ask first the audience. I'm really curious about the audience here tonight. I'd like to know how many people in the audience identify as working artists. And how many, yeah, bravo to the working artists, first of all, sustaining their practice in these times. And secondly, I'd like to ask who in the audience identifies as a tech worker or someone in the technology industry. Great, well thank you, because that helps me understand a little bit more the sort of relational optics of this talk tonight. So I'm going to just leave it at that. I like to ask a lot of questions, and I like to work closely with artists, and I always like to, and I incorporated my desire to hear directly from the artists in the format of my essay tonight. So I did lengthy interviews with artists, and I'll talk more about that later, but I'm going to pass this on to Larry.
So I'm the director of UC Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, which is a so-called encyclopedic museum. We have collections going back to 3000 BC in art, and we have also an encyclopedic film collection. So our responsibilities are not just to living artists, it's really to art per se. But at the same time, I think that it's vitally important that we engage with living artists. And from my perspective, that means everyone, because I think everyone is an artist. I'm kind of Boysian in that regard. And so I want to do things that make everyone who comes to the museum feel like we're activating their potential creative spark somehow, that the museum is a place where people can remember that they too have an artistic energy. So it's very important, and there are a number of specific ways that we've tried to do that. One of the most successful has been working with David Wilson, who's right here, who has really a great gift for extending the reach of experience into broader networks and empowering people to feel permission to participate, particularly, I mean, he didn't start in an institutional context and he still isn't entirely in one, but to the extent that he is, I think he's really helped to bring down the heavy vibe of the place to the extent that it can be, and that's one of the biggest challenges that museums have, is they carry this huge institutional weight that is a little bit of an art experience killer to the extent to which we can just get rid of that thing, whatever it is, soften its edges, and just help people be themselves, I think is good. So specifically, just a couple things, we can get back to this later. Partly as an outgrowth of work that David did in our former building, we built into the new building an art lab, which is a drop-in, all-ages art-making space where anybody who's in the museum can come and make art, and it's interactive and participatory. Another thing that we do is we've tried to spread out the authority a bit, and we hire quite a number of artists as programmers, so the curatorial authority is not just within the professional curators group. We're constantly hiring guest programmers who represent different communities to bring in different voices. Just a couple things that we're trying to do.
Great. So that opens up a kind of area that I didn't think we'd go to quite this quickly, but let's go there. So Drew, this is work that's been done by artists who have been for some period of time sponsored by Facebook. We've just been talking about the way in which you, Larry, have tried to support participatory, innovative, networked sorts of art. And I know, Drew, in other contexts, you've talked about seeking out art that has a kind of network sensibility or a digital sensibility. And I guess I'd like to hear from folks thinking a little bit about how the aesthetics in the room around us speak to or don't speak to the ways in which work is now working in the social media world. When you talk about building a networked world and doing practice live, I start to hear artistic echoes of some of the things that people are doing in social media. How do you think about that?
Well, I think it's sort of vice versa. I think social media reflects the fact that people have lived in communities for millions of years and have networks of communication. And sometimes we have to remind ourselves now to do that because it's easy to stay on the phone and stay on Facebook. But we can also gather in a museum or gather in places like this. And it's, people have had a lot of fun being together over hundreds of years. It's really remarkable.
It's interesting. Is this working? Yes. So at one point in my recent curatorial career, I was the director and curator at the Museum of Craft and Folk Art that doesn't exist anymore, but it was on the Yerba Buena Lane, where now it's a restaurant. So it's Dina is the director of one of the last 1970s artist spaces in San Francisco, and she's been able to keep this space going, so which is very rare. And several of the spaces, including the Museum of Craft and Folk Art, had to close due to the economic situation. And the reason I'm bringing up the Craft and Folk Art to respond to your question, what I've noticed with the Facebook artists that Drew and his team work closely with is that, and when I was writing about the Facebook artist in residency experience, I was trying to understand it in relation to the context in which we live here. It's a very specific context in art world in the Bay Area. It's unlike any other history, social history really, and art history. And one of the things that I experienced firsthand at the Museum of Craft and Folk Art, we created something called the Craft Bar, where we opened our doors every Friday night and we served beer and we had a craft project. And what was so interesting to us is that our audience and our people who came to enjoy beer and craft making were also on their telephones at the same time. And they were also many people who worked in the technology industry who were like burning off steam after work, wanting to work in the analog format. And so I started to think about the digital, digits, our hands, and the hand making, as well as how we use our phones, and that to me that there was no difference between the two human activities, and it really came to kind of a shocking, obvious, representation with our museum programming, which is there was no difference between not only the community of art makers and tech workers, but the desire to convene and to make things together was so important. And what I see with the Facebook artists is this desire for the analog, and really the process. Most of these artists are very much makers, and so that's what I would.
Did you want to jump in?
Sure. I was thinking about the difference between going to a museum in the 1950s or 1960s and having this kind of deep contemplative experience in front of a painting or a work of art, where somehow by standing there for a long duration, that painting is going to change you in some way, shape, or form. And your subjectivity, you'll walk out of the museum thinking about different things, looking at the world differently. Something will change if that painting had its effect. Now I think the way that we view things and the way that we see things has changed. We often Instagram it before we've even thought about it too much to see what the public thinks. This idea of like getting immediately the public idea or the public narrative of that work of art. I'm really interested in trying to go back to the other way of doing things, where we also have this deeply personal, deeply embedded experience of the work of art, where we need the stakes and the boundaries of ourselves to change. But we also need to be able to have that changing be part of the social sphere. We should all be able to have that experience. And I think something that's really interesting that has changed also with the distribution of phones and the internet and everything is people's access to works of art have changed completely. So somebody can see the same thing that I'm looking at on Instagram in Cuba and have a totally different understanding of that, but we can have a conversation about it right there online. If I'm lucky enough to have taken that picture and seen that, I probably have a different viewpoint on it, but maybe they have a whole nother experience of that work of art. That sociality has changed. It doesn't mean I don't want to actually meet that person in person and have a conversation about it. I mean, I think of the internet as a way of meeting people in real life and a connection device more than anything. So,
well, thank you. That's so helpful. And some of the work, particularly David's and other work that we see represented here, is work that begins with a social process, or is deeply connected to a social process. And I'm very curious about how, Drew, you think about the social and practice-based art and the way that art convenes people. How do you think about that?
Well, I was telling Matt about this or something earlier, back to Dave, the first.
We're just going to talk about
you.
Dave.
Jay's here too. Jay Nelson and Dave Wilson were the first two artists in 2012 when we didn't have a analog research lab set up. We were really artists were coming in and just kind of working wherever, finding floors that were yet to be open to spread out their print projects. Jay was running power tools in the courtyard, making literal piles of dust, as people were having working meetings. So that was that felt like super real. It's really hardcore. And so the book opens with Dave's print project, and his handwritten scroll says, "Dear friend." And I really like that the 225 artists that are represented in the book, that's the first piece to kind of open up all this amazing art that has been made by artists from around the world in the context of Facebook's office space, because we always try to pull it back to the process and to the individual and the value of the maker and the idea that we all are intrinsic makers and our creative energy is palpable whether we identify as artists or not. And a big goal in the program, having artists work alongside the rest of the employees, is to inspire that sense that I have an idea, I want to do this, or maybe what I'm already doing in my work, whether a lawyer or a marketer or an engineer, there's a lot of creativity in everything everyone does. And so for me, I think that if the more that the idea of an artist and the mentality and the process of an artist and identity of an artist maybe too could be widespread across all industries and society at large, the more powerful and united we could be as a group.
I just wanted to jump in because Misako Miki is in the audience. An artist who is an artist in residence and whose work is up here on the wall. And Misako wrote something really beautiful when I asked her about her experience at Facebook, and I thought I might read a little quick quote. My work emphasizes painstaking processes which can only be done by hand. I sometimes use digital tools in the process, but the mystical experience of the creative process is physical. This part is not replaceable with anything else. Facebook has a built-in community that creates a specific context. I was particularly interested in their culture of using prints as a communication tool around the campus. So I really feel like when we talk about this relationship of the artist to, in this case, the campus, that those artists who are using the non-digital I just thought that was a really interesting passage.
No, that's really helpful. I was going to turn to you actually for a related point about counterculture and the legacy of the Bay Area. As I look around the room, I see work that at least references earlier psychedelic work that references a deep concern with hand, with form, with making images that relate to the landscape in some way. And I wonder, Natasha, you've written about this very directly. How do you think about the relationship between the art that we see today and earlier countercultural traditions of making in the Bay Area?
Big question. I need to drop some acid to answer that. I think implicit in that question is something that you observed, which is that when you came in, Fred, to look at the work here, you saw a genuine sort of 1970s aesthetic in the room, a kind of sort of experiential, shall we say, psychedelic kind of representation. And I think that there is something to that. And again, I think it goes back to some of the choices that the Facebook Artist in Residence curators have made. But it genuinely represents our community here at this particular moment, and I thought I would pass it on to Larry.
Yeah, the only thing I have to add is that there are a number of countercultures in the Bay Area that are largely forgotten, that go back even further. We go back to the late 19th century, early 20th century. You've got Joaquin Miller living in the Oakland Hills with Isamu Noguchi's father, who was a gender transgressor, Ina Coolbirth, who had the coolest name of any person who ever existed, who was a wonderful librarian, and they were up to some weird stuff up there in the hills in around 1902. And then Xavier Martinez was really strange. And then in the mid 20th century, you have the Dynaton folks. Gordon Onslow Ford, who lived on the Vallejo tugboat, and Lee Mulliken and Wolfgang Pollen. And in a way, I think a lot of this work here harkens back as much to Dynaton as it does to the 70s Beatnik generation.
Say a bit about what Dynaton is.
So Dynaton was a kind of a afterglow of surrealism in a sense. Gordon Onslow Ford was one of the last official surrealists to be named by Breton. I think it was in 1938. Then he spent about 10 years in Mexico taking peyote and came up with a new vision for surrealism that integrated science and indigenous culture in ways that the folks back in Europe hadn't so much. And with Wolfgang Pollen and Lee Mulliken really developed a very interesting new expression of surrealism that in some ways was quite local here. There were aspects of it that related to Asian culture and native culture of this particular region. And you can see in that some really proto-psychedelic stuff going on, and an interest in geometric forms and systems thinking is all kind of embedded in that. And that piece over there, I mean, there's just so many things here that I feel come out as much from Dynaton as from anything else.
That's super helpful. I'm really struck by the tension between kind of the intense individualism of a lot of the expressive work and the systems-oriented thinking that you can see in other parts of it. I've studied earlier corporations and their engagement with the arts. I've spent some time thinking about Xerox PARC, quite a lot of time thinking about IBM and the EAMS. There were different models deployed at that time for integrating the work of artists with the work of the corporation. Xerox PARC in particular believed that they would try to bring in artists, this is the early 70s, who would be able to work with the computational media that the computer scientists themselves were working with. Computer scientists were thought to be open to working with paints and other things that were not necessarily theirs, and that together they would envision new purposes for computers. And Drew, your model here seems a little bit different, and I'm aware that we're sitting in a union hall, and we're using the word work a lot. And we're using the word work sometimes about jobs, sometimes about art, sometimes about the objects that we make when we do our work. And I guess I'd like to hear different panelists ruminate a little bit about, and starting with you, Drew, about how we should think about the work of art now in relation to the new sort of corporate supporters of art, and how we should think about work in art and work in work.
Well, I might go back to the psychedelic.
It's so much easier to ask than answer.
Yeah. Well, these like networks and these systems and stuff. I just like think that how this work relates to all these other bodies of work. I think there's a liberalism in this community and culture, and I think that by what is like felt in the psychedelia of it all is like a lack of borders, a lack of walls, a sense of oneness and harmony and like relationship, a fabric of consciousness that comes in those earlier eras, but also came through in the bedrock of Silicon Valley and the tech community at large with Stuart Brand and the hippies at the time, the tech hippies that were coming up. And so I think that's it's also really important, like hearing someone speak recently about maybe that making something beautiful is at this point in time an act of resistance, and so that talking about how art can be a utility, not just like art. I like to talk about like art not for art's sake, but like what is the real function, like in the tech space especially, like what's the utility of this work. And I think that work that can express, you could call it psychedelic, but like a sense of like empathy, a sense of like unity and oneness, like a lack of walls and barriers has a utility. To present these ideas in front of large groups of people can help soften and open them, and to also invite people who work in an analog capacity into a space that is a digital functioning space to present their ideas and share their space and have it kind of visually dominate the space is an empathetic gesture in and of itself that I think kind of wraps back around with the work.
Thank you. Dina, did you want to jump in on that?
Do I ever? It's really a curious thing for me. I'm a devoted anti-capitalist by heart, but I do believe that this is the system that we live in. This is what puts food in our mouths and roofs over our heads. But we have to understand that the system that we live in wants to exploit us no matter what. So whether you're working at Facebook, whether you're working for a big institution, whether you're working for a library, whether you're an artist in your studio, you're self-exploiting in a specific way. The institution is trying to get as much out of you as humanly possible for as little money as humanly possible. So I'm curious about the ways in which we can actively fund or find ways of pressing up against that, or allowing ourselves room to think beyond that, or just imagine a world in which we weren't so self-exploiting, or we weren't exploited, period, and we didn't exploit others for the sake of our own well-being. Like, what would that look like? How would that actually look? And that's why I pay artists.
Well, I love, of course, aligned with a lot of what Dina says and the politics around labor and cultural production. In the essay in the Facebook book, which we're calling it now, of the Artist Residency, I tried to make sense of the Facebook Artist in Residency in relation to other models. So I did talk about Xerox PARC, and in the 90s when I was a curator at Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, I worked with Margaret Crane and John Winnett, who were engaged at Xerox PARC, who are wonderful digital artists. And we had many exploratory discussions and conversations about the relationship that really embedded in Silicon Valley. At the time, it was like the first .com boom, which many of you didn't live through. But it was a moment when artists were really grappling with what was available to them coming out of technology. And so many artists were actually using the new, as Fred mentioned, at Xerox PARC, were using the new technology in order to make art, which is a very different model from the Facebook Artist in Residency. Where they are aligned, both of these Artist in Residency programs, is that they would pay the artists to make art in context, in situ, in Silicon Valley, which is really interesting, whether you're using deploying the new technologies, which you're not doing at Facebook necessarily, but many artists that I interviewed ended up using new technologies based on their experiences at Facebook, and that's also in the essay, so that you might have an artist who came to Facebook who was practicing in a certain way, who would end up from the experience of being in that community for that period of time, using the new technologies that were available to them. So in that respect, and just to feed off of what Dina said, which is really interesting, there were several artists who resisted my interview questions, which were, how was your experience at Facebook? How did it change your practice? What was your experience in the corporation? And there were a few artists who said, I did it, I was there, but I don't want to talk about it. I have mixed feelings about having worked at Facebook. And then there were others who were, as I read from Masako Miki, who were very clear about their, who they were when they went in and what they were making in relation to that community. So remember, the wonderful thing about the Artist in Residency at Facebook is that artists are paid to make artwork, which is huge.
And very rare.
And very rare in this community and very rare in the larger Bay Area. So
Can I add one thing? What's also really amazing about the Artist in Residency program is that you can work with a very small group of people and you have a ton of artistic freedom. When you're commissioned or contracted by a collector or by somebody else, you're usually working with somebody totally, very rarely do you get to choose that person that you work with. And you're also restraining the parameters of your art according to their needs. And I think programs like this actually open up the capacity for what art can be in many ways. And it just provides pragmatic resources to artists who are very, very much in need of those. So.
Doug, did you want to jump in?
Well, I don't think I have anything to say.
Okay, great. So, I'm sure that you had a good shot there. I want to turn the floor over to the audience momentarily, but I want to close our portion just by asking a question that I hope will be sort of forward focused for everyone. So, it's clear to me that building and sustaining a rich ecology for the arts in the Bay Area depends on more than money. Okay? Money helps a lot, but it's clearly not enough. And I'd like to hear each of you say a little bit about what else we need, what else we can do. And I'll start at the far end, Larry, just go for it.
Rent control.
Okay, great.
That would solve the problem.
Okay.
So, I was just in Basel, Switzerland, which you'd think would have the same problems as San Francisco, right? Perfect country, perfect climate, high standard of living, highly educated. You'd think that place would be like gentrified to the max, and that you'd have a kind of monocultural situation and not enough space for kind of creative people or people of sort of working class people. But I went there and the place did not feel like San Francisco. It felt like a totally hybrid, diverse, vibrant, richly textured community. I thought, wow, how is this happening? So I was staying with some folks there, some Swiss people, and they said, because the city owns half the real estate and they control the rents and they keep them low, so that the city is like this. It's like a planned socialist city. And this is how the people want it, and so that's how they make it. They chose through, it's a democratic country, they voted to have a government that prioritized diversity and culture, and that's what they got. And it's up to us. If that's what we want, we can get it. We have to vote for it and demand it, and we can have it. I hope. It might be too late for rent control. We'll be rent controlling at $10,000 for one bedroom, but still, it will protect the artists in the future.
Thanks.
You asked also what other things we can create or at least deploy, and I think one of them is in order to keep a vibrant artistic community alive, we need criticism, really thoughtful platforms like tonight's, for example, where people can talk about art. We need, I would say, we also need recent people creating art history and dialogue and language around what we're experiencing, so that it's not too late, as Larry says, so that we're not in a situation where it's too late, which we really are almost, I would actually say we are already too late, but.
I love transformative experiences and that kind of concept. And the last time I talked publicly, a lot of people, it was a industry-specific event, and people were like, "Hey, like, why aren't we supported as artists and as art institutions?" And kind of putting it back on the audience to talk about. For me, the reason I work in art is because art provided me with transformative experiences over and over again. So I got like turned on and plugged in and dilated to a quality of life. I feel devoted to art as it's like responsible for my quality of life. So if we can find ways to confront people with transformative experiences, then they will invest in the power of the way that it's enhanced their quality of life. It's an abstract idea, but and there's no like roadmap to accomplish it. But I do think that firsthand that being able to be dilated enough to receive the kind of experience that's possible in art is something that takes time and breath and kind of pause. And I think that culturally, as a hyper-capitalistic country that we are, our time is economized and pressurized in a way that doesn't allow us to be dilated enough to have transformative experiences as we could. And so it's a whole cultural shift issue.
Yeah.
Go for it, Drew.
So the building that you're standing on right now, sitting in right now, this room hosted the 1934 general strike. And that was a coming together of over 114 different unions in the city who had all used this building as a kind of a meeting hall, but also there's a daycare over here, a vaudeville theater, there are medical facilities upstairs. You could get dental work done in 1922. I mean, all for the price of a union membership, which was like $1 a month back then. So I think about what has changed about the way we work and the way we play together and how we actually come together as disparate, different groups of people who have different labor conditions and different ideas about how we work and how we play. But if we have a space in which we can come and do all these things together, it's really crucial. And one of those things that I try to do at the lab is kind of collapsing disciplinary boundaries of all kinds. Like we host film, music, weirdo workshops, weirdos, period, comedians, like, whatever I find challenging or bring a different audience into the lab, and hopefully it creates this kind of intermixing, cross-germination. That's what I'm looking for.
Great, thank you.
Can I just add one more thing, because we have Patricia, who's in the audience at Southern Exposure. Another way is to, in the tech industry, with venture capitalism, we give money back to seed new projects. And I think that the model of, for example, Southern Exposure, that allows to seed new, small, maybe home galleries, like we had Farley Farley from the Worth Rider giving us a talk the other day, and he was talking about how he had received a grant from Southern Exposure in order to start his own home gallery, which was a really important gallery in Berkeley for a lot of artists. So I would say that that's also another to respond to what you're saying.
Thank you.
Yes, so that money's from the Warhol Foundation, but it could as easily be from Facebook or any one of the corporations here.
Actually, that's 2/3 of the money is from the Warhol Foundation, and now 1/3 of it also comes from the city of San Francisco.
Excellent. Glad to hear.
Comment for you.
But the corporations could
do the same thing, exactly.
Multiply it. It should be an example that should spread. And it doesn't take a lot of money. And I mean, I think the Warhol grant is what, $50,000, and it impacts dozens of people every
We now
year.
receive $125,000 annually, and to date, over 10 years, we have distributed $633,000 back into the community to 166 projects.
It's great. Fantastic. So there's one other thing I just want to mention. I'll just throw this out there. You all know about percent for art. So I'm thinking, well, what about percent for artists? And maybe it's time to think about the actual people who make the work and figure out some mechanism by which some of the enormous wealth in this community is directed back to the people who are making the work. Percent for art doesn't necessarily go to artists in this community. And maybe we need to find a way to structurally support the artists who are here.
Great, thank you. You're here, absolutely. Let me open it up now to the audience. If you have questions, please just raise your hand. I'll try to keep things moving. Go for it.
All right. Question and comment. One, since we're talking about alternative exposure, the deadline for the next round is October 12th. Anybody has any questions, please feel free to grab me. I'd be happy to talk to you about it. But thinking about the fact of that activity and what we do which is about none of the projects come back into Southern Exposure as an organization. And so I want to pick up from there to touch on Natasha about what you said about the reservations that artists had about talking about the work that they were doing as Facebook. And the question that I have is, to what extent is that about not even just about Facebook itself or even working within the framework of a tech company, but the extent to which we indoctrinate artists to sanctify operations within certain spaces. We sanction certain spaces and their operations within certain spaces, and anything outside of those spaces is either discounted or suspect.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about museums. I've got a museum guy right here on my right. I mean, I think, or what we sort of endow as sacred art world spaces, right? And which is part of a whole art world economy. Same for certain platforms for writing or for producing art. And so I think that maybe what we're going for here is an idea where, and I think Drew used the metaphor of sort of tearing down the walls. I think we need to think expansively, because I think artists are also part of the resistance to thinking outside of these bastions of in art forum type artworks and forums that we consider somehow more worthy than others, that we have to start really thinking about breaking down certain hierarchies in order to allow for a circulation not just of ideas but of economic reality. I mean, a circulation of money, let's be honest. We need to think of new models for that.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think it's really critical. Part of our work, just one piece of it, is really expanding our sense of the culture and where culture can happen and who it belongs to. And it's not just, the art school production, the magazine sanctioned production and so on. And I think it's great that the work that Southern Exposure does doesn't necessarily come back to Southern Exposure. It's about sort of pushing it out and extending it. 2 days ago, I was at San Quentin. I was very lucky to be on a tour of the murals there and visited with the artists who are making art there. There's an art community at San Quentin. We don't hear about it, we don't know about it, but it's happening, and it's part of our world in a deep way. So yeah, and I think what Drew was talking about happening at Facebook, more of it, more art, more places. Thank you.
Yep, go for it.
So that would sort of lead into a question: how do you convince these companies, like tech companies or otherwise, that it's of value to, say, the shareholders, right? The bottom line. So not just the concept or the creative space, but if you had to convince sort of the top brass, like an artist residency is really good for your company, how might you do that?
We've been able to have the support of the leadership of Facebook believe in the intrinsic value of this, but and that's been a luxury, thus far. But we've come to realize that in a metrics-driven industry across all big companies, a goal that I have is like this program's successful when companies are copycatting it in all kinds of ways. When like all big companies are like, it's like. You have snacks, you have dry cleaning, you have art programming. This is like what makes a healthy company. And so, it's snacks. You got snacks. You guys have snacks here, right?
Everything is driven by
Snacks. So the point is that we are now moving forward, figuring out how we can create metrics to prove its value and publish those metrics so that it can be a little bit more in the face of other companies and shareholders that there is a real intrinsic value.
There are a handful of other companies that are sort of out in this territory. One that isn't very public about it is Autodesk. That has, many of you know about the Autodesk thing. It's not public, but they clearly value the presence of art in their corporate space. Another one, Nissan sponsors a big prize for Japanese artists. They spend a lot of money to support contemporary Japanese artists. Why? They're a car company. I'm one of the jurors for that, so I had dinner with the CEO of Nissan, and I was like, why do you do this? And he said a lot of stuff. I didn't understand any of it, but I thought he should, whatever it was that he said, he should say that to other CEOs.
Makes sense to them. One thing I think that's really important about why we have hosted a Facebook exhibition here is I want to emphasize the fact that not only is this a payment structure for artists that exists, but it's really important to see that work that's being done locally and in kind of a public space that's easily accessible to people from the community so that they can see that these tech giants are here, but they're also, there's work being done and strides being made to try to embrace people from the community in a real way. And so I think this is why this kind of project is really important. I'm really working to try to endow one of our residencies and to try to have like one of these ways that we pay an artist to basically live and work in the Bay Area because it's so expensive. To be able to have time and space to do their work is to ask corporations and different companies to kind of pick up some of that bill a little bit. So, yeah.
Thanks. So a question in the far back, yep.
Hi, thank you.
Louder, please.
My question is about the pressures to perhaps marginalize the content and form of art that digital technology perhaps imposes. So I'll give an example from the field of literature. So Tim Parks has written a lot about the pressures to write for a global audience in such a way that makes writing that's deeply embedded in a particular time and place difficult. So he uses people like Haruki Murakami or Elena Bronte, for example. And for myself, I find that it's quite difficult to work in my medium, which is Chinese calligraphy, because that's inherently something written in a language that most people cannot understand. And so Instagram and Facebook have been very helpful in the sense that I can see the work of other calligraphers. And we're connected in Hong Kong, Taipei, Shanghai. But I wonder if there's something more that the medium could do for people to make that art form more accessible to other people. So for someone like me, if it means spending a lot of time explaining things in notes, hoping that someone might read it, that's one thing. But when I, for example, I am around here, I see a lot of art that on one level is very apprehendable to a layperson. Whereas if I put a piece of Chinese calligraphy up, you can appreciate it on a formal level perhaps, but there's another level of understanding that would take time, would take money, but you could just...
That's a good, yeah, it's such a good argument for art criticism.
Right, back to that context and art history and cultural history is very important. And by the way, I mean, I didn't mention this, but I wanted to know how many educators were in the room and professors, and Pei Ting is a professor at Berkeley. And so I do think that criticism and language and context as well. Yeah, it's a bigger question and new software.
We've had someone in the back waiting very patiently. I'll come back up front in a minute. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That was very helpful and very good conversation. I'm working in a tech company, which is a robot painter, and it can. Sorry. Yeah.
Oh,
but the fact is,
painter.
we wanted. We are a Estonian company. It started 2 years ago, and we just moved here with the vision of art, and we only want to help artists and commission them and make the city the better place and more beautiful working spaces like the city walls. But we are working 5 months, and our business plan failed because no investor is interested in art. So when we're talking about advertisement, or they offer about marketing and advertisement, they are so interested, but with our mission and vision about helping artists to get commission, and we make more art in the city, more than noise of advertisement, that failed. So we changed the plan to get help from companies like Facebook, Google, and actually we commissioned 100% the artists, and then they sponsor us to just make this happen. But still we are struggling that how this kind of collaboration happen. And any suggestion?
Keep doing what you're doing, because I mean, these are the new models that need to happen, and you need a lot of energy and patience, but keep doing what you're doing.
I mean, it sounds really interesting to me. To the extent that I understand it, it sounds very fresh, but I think, you found out hopefully quickly enough what was wrong with the model. Now you've got to find, the sweet spot. What do people really need and want here? Hopefully they want some art, but yeah, you have to figure out how to make it work.
Great. Thanks. I saw a question here, and then I'll go over to you.
Yeah, hi. Going back to the conversation about metrics for the survival of art or art programs, social media and Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat are great examples of companies that have boomed with metrics. People sign up because it's something that connects them. Everyone has a need to connect, and no one's excluded from that. So in terms of translating that into the survival of art or an art program, art is parallel to Facebook, and it's also something that connects people. So how can you provide more context behind art to help people feel the need, storytelling aspect behind it, so that it connects? I write about artists, so I see higher metrics when the art has more storytelling behind it, kind of like Humans of New York. So how can we provide that for art? Do you think it's possible that storytelling and connecting can help provide higher metrics?
I do think that's part of it. At museums, we face a bigger challenge, just getting people to feel open to the idea that they're going to experience something meaningful in a space that is so kind of ponderous. So there's so many things about our affect that we need to address. Storytelling is just one piece of it. But one example of how we're doing that in an upcoming show, we have a show coming up of a Ming Dynasty Chinese painter, speaking of Chinese calligraphy, Chen Heng Shou. He's an amazing guy. He was kind of a drunk loser. He failed his exams, but he was a great painter. He was really a wonderful painter. And we're doing a show. It's very rare to have a monographic show of a historical Asian artist. You never see that. So we thought it was good to kind of take an individual and say, who was this person? But still we thought, who's going to come? You know, people aren't going to like flock to a show of a Ming Dynasty painter. So one of the things that Chen Heng Shou did was when he would get drunk, he would write poems on his paintings. They don't make any sense, but still, they're there. And so I got Devendra Banhart to agree to do the audio guide. So Devendra is going to, read the poems. You can go through the show and hear Devendra kind of becoming Chen Heng Shou. And that is a storytelling straight from the art, but through a voice that hopefully will attract people. I mean, it's just one example, but if you have to go through a lot of obstacles to get to the gallery that has that audio guide, you're not going to get there. So from the front door on, everything has to be welcoming and engaging.
Well, and for all those talking about this physical work, the aura of objects and the handmade, the digital internet tools provide a lot of opportunity to have that work seen by wider audiences, but if you don't get in front of it, you could tell that it's beautiful and it's well done from a photograph on a screen, but like the deeper, more subtle value of it, you need to be physically in front of, to the point of like, how do you physically have access to the work and not just a illusion or image of it.
Thanks.
This was touched on a little bit earlier, but I'm curious if you could talk more about the word analog in Analog Research Lab, and that decision to have all of the artwork handmade and things like that. Just looking around, the work here is very graphic and colorful, but I'm curious if you have ever worked with artists or plan to work with artists that even use Facebook as raw material or as a subject itself.
So a lot of the program is meant to kind of try to break up like a potential monoculture that could happen in a singular institution or corporation. So by having these outside ideas come in, we could hopefully try to like chip away at that. So navel gazing is something I'm very sensitive to in the programming that we do, and we really want as authentic as possible of ideas. We try to find artists who aren't, there's design and there's art, and it's like, there's a lot of different ways to differentiate the two of them. But we look to artists who have a pretty singular dedication, like a meditation, like kind of like a conduit to an idea, a devotional practice that they are maybe sacrificing safety and security to bring to the world. And we want to bring like that in. So the analog thing is also just that we all can acknowledge that a screen can't build an aura. You could do as much creative work as you want on a computer, but you're never going to be like, wow, that one really had a lot of creative juice go through it. So providing opportunity away from screens, providing real-life physical engagement to counterbalance the percentage of time individuals spend in front of screens is an intention of the program too. So providing more screen time is not one of our goals or interests. And also providing more metaphors and more alternative views to existence and society and being as a person is a priority over new ideas, more talking about our own product.
Good. Is there other questions? Yeah, in the far corner. Go for it.
I don't know if this was mentioned, but I felt that it's something important. I think that in terms of like we were talking earlier, and maybe we can kind of move on from what was just said about corporations getting involved in like this kind of like screen versus the handmade. It's really, I think, important to acknowledge that the quality of life shift that happens for the workers in these places, especially here in Silicon Valley, when so many people are working behind the screen, are working in office-type kind of environments to provide a space for contemplation or interaction with a form that doesn't exist, in terms of the daily routine, right? So I just wanted to make sure that it's taught about that.
This is, I'm sorry, so Nels Malzanati is a great artist working between San Francisco and Toronto and all over the world. And she was an artist that we worked with in New York, and actually her work, some of the source imagery comes from social media and the internet, and is dealing with the Arab Spring and Occupy. And so the role that Facebook and other social media platforms had in those, she's one example of a more overtly relevant or related artist content and work as opposed to like more metaphorical or whatever.
And just to, in the essay and in the quotes from the artists, many of the working artists at the Artist in Residency program at Facebook talked about how the workers at Facebook would interact with them and would spend time coming back and dialoguing, and really they were turned on. I think that's a big part of what you're doing with the residency too, is to bring art to the culture at Facebook. And it seems to me, based on my investigation interviewing the artists, that it is a very successful model.
So we've come to the end of our time together. We'll stick around, but for now, please join me in thanking Dina and the lab for hosting this evening, and our panelists.
I also want to thank Jessica Schaefer for, without her
All proceeds from purchasing the book go back to the lab, so please consider that.
Thank you all for coming out.
Oh, that's great. Good.
Yes. I love when first person saw it.